Okay, cool. So we should be live right now, and I'm just going to make sure that that is the case. And oh, yes. So it says we're live. However, the video is streaming. Okay, excellent. So that's perfect. Now let me. I put it on gallery so we can see now. Awesome. So it's really my great pleasure to welcome today's guest to the Dartseal Commons podcast. We are very pleased and honored to have Dr. Muhammad Aurangzeb Ahmad with us today. Dr. Ahmad is the principal research scientist at the Kensai Incorporated and affiliate assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Washington, Tacoma. His previous academic appointments were at the Department of Computer Science at the University of Minnesota, Center for Cognitive Science at University of Minnesota, Faculty of Engineering in Istinye University, and the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur. He also has wide experience in applied machine learning across several industries. And to give you to give the listeners a little bit of further hints as to his research interests, he's interested in, amongst other things, fairness, accountability, transparency, ethics in AI, explainable AI, interpretable machine learning, and AI in healthcare. So really, it's such a pleasure to have Dr. Ahmad here with us. Thank you, Dr. Ahmad, for joining us. Now, to pose the very first question, because this is a question non-specialists I found over the years, I think it's changing now progressively, thankfully, but it's still, it's still a little slow going. It's definitely a lot better today than it was 5 years ago, when I personally, or 5 or 6 years ago, I personally got quite interested in ethical questions around artificial intelligence. I remember 5 or 6 years ago posing some of these ethical problems and quandaries, and some, otherwise obviously intelligent people would retort, well, the stuff that you're posing, this is all very, in so many words to paraphrase, this is all very science fiction-esque, and these are concerns we don't have to think about so much, etc., etc. Thinking about the really sort of Hollywood type scenarios of around Terminator and things like that. But all that being said, what is artificial intelligence, first and foremost? Can you tell us, please?
Yes. So first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So now, first, to address your question regarding what is artificial intelligence, or something which is, as let's say, fundamental to what defines a human intelligence. So that is, before we define artificial intelligence, we should define what intelligence is. Something which is elusive, but at the same time that we can define it multiple ways. So intelligence could be defined as, let's say, ability to, let's say react to changes in the world. And if you take let's say an evolutionary perspective, then intelligence can be defined in terms of, let's say, the end point of a long process where let's say organisms are able to react in a real-time manner to changes, as well as there are aspects of planning, anticipating the future. So now when we transfer that to, let's say, context of computing, where artificial intelligence comes in, so classically speaking, the definitions of artificial intelligence constituting, let's say, the goal was to replicate human intelligence, so to impart the ability to think in machines. And to add some historical context, when the field of artificial intelligence started, and I'm talking about 40s and 50s, our view of intelligence, or at least in the computing community, was very mechanical and logical in nature. So it was thought that, let's say, tasks like, let's say, proving theorems, doing complex mathematical operations, because things which were extremely difficult for the vast majority of people to do so. So these were considered to be the pinnacle of human thought. And it would be extremely difficult for computers to program. And it turned out that it actually did not take too long, just less than 20 years for us to realize that these were actually relatively easy to program. So the terminology that we use in literature is that the hard problems were actually easy, and easy problems like, quote unquote, easy problems like, let's say, recognizing a human face, or just things like walking, having a conversation, things which come naturally to humans, these were considered to be extremely difficult for machines. And in many cases, it took 70 years of research to come even very relatively close to these properties, these traits that we just take granted as humans.
Amazing, very, very interesting. Lots to unpack there. The hard problems turned out to be relatively simple, and the so-called the softer problems, the easier problem.
No. Yeah, the easy problems.
The easier problems turned out to be a lot harder. What are some? I mean, looking ahead into the future, say 5 years down the line, what are some of the major easy problems, or problems as such, that you know, as a computer scientist, that people in your line of work in artificial intelligence research and so forth, machine learning, and I want to unpack, I would ask you to unpack some of these terms as well as we continue. What are some of these major problems that you're seeking to address in the next 5 years, shall we say?
Yeah, so let me start with a problem which has been, at least the perception has been given in the general media, that it's just 2-3 years away, self-driving cars. So if you look at, say, tweets by Elon Musk going back all the way back to 2015, 2016, so the mantra has been, oh, self-driving cars are just 2 years away. And it's like almost like clockwork. You hear from Elon Musk every 2 years that it's 2 years away, and well, it has been like that for a while. So, for example, he predicted that by 2020 we'll have 1 million self-driving cars, and well, it's almost 2022 now. And again, the reason for that is that it's a classic example of another problem which was vastly underestimated in terms of complexity. That said, I do envision that we will have some real progress in the next 5 years. But even after 5 years, I would say there are going to be contexts where self-driving cars may take much longer time. And the reason for that is that when we talk about self-driving cars, we are not talking about a single problem. So driving in, let's say, country road is very different from driving in highways, which is very different from driving during rush hour in Manhattan, versus, let's say, driving in, let's say, city in South Asia, let's say Delhi, Lahore, Dhaka, where, well, traffic is anarchy. So it's, from a computational perspective, all these problems are very different. And I foresee that we won't be able to solve all of these problems. I think we will solve sufficient number of these problems to have, let's say, hopefully a viable business model where enough of these systems are online. But most likely, let's say, it's less likely that we'll still have these things deployed massively. Beyond that, I would say that even if we assume that there is literally no fundamental progress in artificial intelligence or machine learning in the 5 years, let's say tomorrow researchers stop doing any research, enough progress has been made in the last 10 years, and computing, and also because of increase in computing power, that there are still a vast number of domains where machine learning and AI still needs to be applied, that there's enough to go around, enough improvement that can be made in the next 10 years or 5 years, or whatever time horizon that we are looking at. And then the other thing that I would say is that there is, in certain domains, we have been trying to apply machine learning and AI over the last, definitely over the last 5 to 10 years. So let's say even my domain, machine learning and healthcare, AI in healthcare. So despite 50 years of trying to integrate AI and machine learning, you actually don't see this as a standard practice. And the reason for that is that, I mean, there are multitude of reasons, but just let's say trying to create scenarios where, let's say, there's a mapping between the technical aspects and how you actually deliver the problem. So that is a massive issue. So we started with the ethical and moral issues. So it used to be, let's say, 10 years ago, a side discussion. And this is something which is now becoming central to deployment of AI and machine learning system. And the reason for that is that although we have had AI and machine learning for 50 years, it's only now, I would say, again, in the last 10 years, that combination of three factors. Computing power has become extremely cheap, and has been becoming cheaper and cheaper for the last 50 years. The second being that it is now extremely easy to collect and analyze massive amounts of data. And this is unprecedented in human history. And then lastly, one can argue that it's only in the last 5 years where computing has become, let's say, an integral part of socio-technological systems. So, I mean, if you use a cell phone, then data is being collected about you, and you are generating massive amounts of data. So going back to the question regarding what could be done in terms of challenges. Just predicting human behavior, manipulating human behavior. I mean, that's something which has been going on for a while, but now we will have more and more refined techniques. Emulating human behavior, that is also going to become more common. So we heard about metaverse less than a month ago. And I do recall having a conversation with a friend, actually in 2015, where I predicted that this is going to be the next frontier for Facebook. So people interacting in a virtual environment, and given that the massive amounts of data that they have and what they can collect, the next step within that is going to be just the to emulate people's personalities, and then when people pass away, emulating their personality. So if you have a relative who has passed away, then you could still quote unquote interact with them, or at least their simulation. So that's another thing which is going to get more common. And then to end this thread, there was a group of researchers who in 2020, they predicted that by 2025, at least half of the content, if not more, on the internet, in terms of videos, it's going to be deepfakes. So basically content which is not real, but it's actually generated by computers. So how that is going to interact and basically wreak havoc on basically political cultures globally, I mean, that is to be seen.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for that. I mean, again, so much to think about, to unpack, so many different threads. I mean, on just one of your points, Ari, regarding the possibility of technology existing or being developed around, which would enable us to interact with our deceased relatives. I remember coming across an article within the last few months where I was mentioning that Microsoft, for example, and this is I'm sure other companies have it as well, actually have a patent on this technology, which is very, very interesting, and of course harkens raises a lot of ethical questions, but also is reminiscent of a lot of science fiction movies and how they've kind of postulated how things may turn out historically. The ethical question seems to be something that one can't help but sort of raise in this regard. I wanted to actually ask you in the realm of healthcare and AI. You mentioned that some of the ethical, if I understood you correctly, I'm indeed remembering correctly, you mentioned that some of the ethical questions were being posed and they slowed down the work. Is that correct? Did I understand correctly? No.
No.
No, sorry. So the ethical questions weren't being posed. So could you say a little bit about what are the ethical questions in the domain of healthcare and AI? And how are those questions being unpacked? How those questions slowing down the work or indeed sort of facilitating the work?
Sure. So, okay. So let me actually start with a relatively mundane example, because I think that illustrates that it's a problem which is that's something that we don't have to confront in the future, something which is already here. And another general comment that I would make is that a lot of ethical and moral dilemmas that we face in the application of AI and machine learning, in most contexts, not all, but in most contexts, they are an extension of the kind of issues that we have historically encountered. In other contexts, it's just that AI and machine learning, they change the scale at which we encounter that problem.
So just for sorry to interrupt, just for our viewers and listeners' benefit, can you define for us what machine learning is, please?
Sure. So machine learning can be thought of as a subfield within artificial intelligence, where we deal with models or, let's say, software or programs which learn with data. So the more data, so the idea is that, let's say, if you are building a model which can, let's say, predict if somebody is going to have a heart attack in the next 5 years. The idea is that by looking at patients or medical history of patients who have had heart attacks in the last 10 years, our model can learn from that data. And then over time, as it gets exposed to more and more data, it learns from that data and it gets better and better and more, which is another way of saying it, better with better accuracy. It can predict if somebody is going to get heart attack or not. Okay, so now coming back to the
yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So basically, crunching tons of data, and sort of to then come up with predictions, right? And this happens all the time, of course, if I'm not mistaken, right? I mean, this is putting even aside healthcare for now, which is increasingly a domain in which these types of things are applied. I mean, it's been a very long standing practice in the world of business, right? Pure business, purely understood in sort of the Amazon sense, and for example, right? I mean, these am I not correct that these companies, they actively predict, right? I mean, this is a whole discussion around algorithms, for example, how it is that they suggest these products, whether it's products or YouTube videos on YouTube and things like that. Netflix is another one.
Correct. Yes. So so the various examples that you gave, so they would fall under the umbrella of what we call recommendation systems. So behind the scenes, they are recommending something, that they are recommending what product to buy, what movie to watch, so on and so forth. So just to give an example of how powerful some of these techniques can be. So a few years ago, this was actually reported in the New York Times, where so since we have an international audience, so just to give some context, in the US, and I guess it's also true for many other countries, you get coupons in mail, so regarding different products that you may be interested in. So in this particular incident, Target is a large retailer in the supermarket in the US. So they got their customer service got a call from a concerned father who said, who called, and then he, somewhat enraged, he said that I've been getting these coupons related to pregnancy related products, and I have 2 teenage daughters, and how dare you people send me these coupons? And the Target customer service, they apologized, and then just a week after that, he called back Target, and then he asked them, how did you folks know that my teenage daughter is pregnant?
It's so funny. I was literally talking to, someone at home about this literally like 2 hours ago, this very story.
Yeah, so basically, behind the scenes, what's going on is that literally millions of people go and buy products at Target, and there are billions of transactions over the course of years. So what machine learning does is that with machine learning, you extract common patterns of things that people buy. In this case, the model was picking up on common things that women who are pregnant that they buy. And the thing is, these models, they're not deliberate. It's not that it understands the concept of pregnancy or even the concept of buying. It's just very good at picking up patterns. And then based on that, it's just sending out these coupons. And then after that, the story goes that there's now an element of randomness in the way that Target and even other organizations send out coupons because they don't actually want the models to be too accurate, because that would actually spook. In this case, it did spook people a little bit.
It's so fascinating. That is so interesting and spooky and lots to think about. How the business world works and how business people, men and women, have to think. Like they could be super accurate, but that would freak people out. So they've introduced an element of randomness so interesting. So sorry to interrupt, but that's fascinating. Please continue.
Yes. Going back to the previous question, I lost my train of thought.
So we were talking about machine learning, the question around ethics in the context of healthcare and machine learning, AI, etc.
Okay, correct. Yeah. Yeah. So I was saying that many of the problems that we encounter, many, again, to emphasize many, not all, they are an extension of the kind of problems that we have had to deal with literally for decades, and in some cases since the dawn of medicine itself. So we're talking about tens and thousands of years. It's just that what AI and machine learning allow is that we have to now confront this problem at a much larger scale. So a physician can only see that many patients at a given time, and now machines do not have that constraints. The second issue I would say is that, again, in some contexts, not all, it also allows us to, wherever possible, quantify these problems. And that is very important in a good way and also in a bad way. In a good way, because when we can quantify the problems, then we can see how good or bad we are doing in terms of the outcome. And that also, with that, it also brings with it the promise to improve the outcomes. And then the negative and the downside is that then, the possibility that you can get fixated too much on the numbers and the human can get lost. Okay, so that's the context. In terms of, so just focus on one particular type of problem is, I would say, resource allocation. So what do we mean by that? So since we are in the middle of a pandemic, hopefully at the tail end of the pandemic, so think of the following scenario, and this is very common in ICUs or intensive care units globally during the pandemic, is that you have an ICU at a hospital. There are only beds available for, let's say, 20 people, and 100 people arrive at the hospital. And that's it. You can procure some additional resources, and at maximum, you can just take 30 people in the ICU, and that's stretching things. So now the problem is that you have to make a decision. you have limited resources in terms of physicians, in terms of medical equipment, in terms of time. And which means that out of these 50 people, you can only see 30 people, and these 20 people have to be turned away. So now, traditionally, a human has to, a physician or a group of physicians, they have to make a judgment regarding what 30 people to see and what 20 people to not see. So usually that's based on things like, in an ideal scenario, things like how severe the condition is. So factors like, let's say, how old the person is, who is likely to survive, not likely to survive. The physicians, they have to base that on their medical judgment. There's an element of subjectivity in that. So if you ask 10 different physicians, then maybe you'll get 10 different answers, so on and so forth. So where AI and machine learning come into play is that this promise that we still have to do risk stratification, but hopefully we'll be able to do that in a more, let's say, judicial way. So maybe reduce that element of subjectivity that we have, having the ability to risk stratify better. If we are talking about resource allocation, then let's say if you're not talking about just one hospital, but let's say we have to do resource allocation in New York, or let's say in Beijing. So we are talking about population of more than 10 million, a large number of hospitals. So the optimization problem, how do we allocate these resources, becomes beyond the pale of a human or even a group of humans. And that's where the real promise of machine learning comes into play, that how do we allocate these resources in a more fair and judicious manner. And let's say if you have to do that in real time, it's beyond the pale of human. So that's where these ethical and moral problems become paramount. But then there's another question which arises, which traditionally it was more theoretical, but now it becomes very practical, which is that, so we have been using the term fairness, but now we have to define fairness with respect to what? Because there are multiple notions of fairness, and fairness changes with respect to context and who is asking the question. I'll give an example. So we're talking about machine learning models. They are powered by data. And so what if we have, and these are not theoretical scenarios, these are real world scenarios, things that that myself and people like me, they have to deal with in day-to-day basis. So let's say we have a model, to go back to our example, which can predict heart failure. But it just happens to be the case that, let's say in the context of the United States, it just happens to be the case that we don't have enough data for, let's say, a particular minority group for that hospital or that location, let's say for African Americans. And because of that, in general, let's say the accuracy of the model is 90%, but for African Americans, it's 65%. So now if you use that model for resource allocation, then we are in some sense being less fair to African Americans, because the model is not going to do as well for African Americans in this case. So there's that notion of fairness. If from the perspective of the physician, so she may want to have
on that very point, say if I may quickly make the following sort of interjection. I mean, so I wanted you to speak to this as well, which is that it has been written about, not extensively enough, but enough at this point for it to be more widely known, which is that whether these very AI systems are racist insofar as, what sort of, I mean, you mentioned the question of fairness, right? And fairness varies from context to context, as you say, and, who's asking the question, right, as to whether something is fair or not. Because just because a system may be fair for one group of people, to your point, it may not necessarily be the case that it's fair for all groups of people, right? So as an aside, I mean, or related aside, right? It's been pointed out that that a lot of these AI systems have some sort of inbuilt racism in there. And I don't think this particular point that I was about to make right now is actually, we know this for fact, but very strangely, these sort of facial recognition sort of systems, they very often categorize Black people as gorillas, right? And I don't know if that's just a pure mistake, or and this has happened, this came up, right? And or I mean, this is like the conspiracy theorist and me wondering, because Silicon Valley is full of not only, but it's full of like white boys, right? And I wouldn't be I mean, I don't know, that's like a conspiracy theory on my part. In any case, like we know that these a lot of these systems are inherently racist just because of what they've been programmed to look out for. Could you speak to some of this, right? The problem of racism with AI.
Yes, excellent question. So let me actually start with the example that you gave regarding facial recognition. And let me first add the disclaimer that, at least as far as we know, but so it's not the case that in Silicon Valley, there's, let's say, a league of evil software engineers who are creating these systems. And the reason and I emphasize this by saying that the reason for that is that, at least for something as obvious as facial recognition system, let's say developed by Google or Apple or whatnot, a racist system would be bad for business. And so if we just take a very business-oriented mindset to it.
Good point, yes.
But that said, the issue is that machine learning systems, at the end of the day, they're only going to be as good as the data. So what you put into them.
Can I sorry to interrupt again? Could you speak also to this related point, which is the sort of what you say makes very good logical sense, and I don't want to, I'm not pushing against that, but just from a purely philosophical point of view, putting aside conspiracy theory, right? And sometimes conspiracy theory can be like, a jokey way of trying to make sense of things, sometimes very weird stuff that happens. And this is a deep philosophical, I mean, it's accepted in a sort of realm of philosophy, which no doubt you're aware of, that, the technologies that we create, right, philosophically speaking, necessarily have imbued in them, we imbue them with our sort of assumptions of the world, right? So, so the point being, not to say that Silicon Valley is necessarily, full of racist sort of white boys, although it turns out that Silicon Valley is very sexist, right? A lot has been written about this recently, not enough again, but there's some deep sort of issues of sexism in Silicon Valley, women sort of struggling. Have very often struggled. So you see my point, like, how are these technologies, like, we can't put aside the fact that if I, for example, were to create ex nihilo, and nothing happens ex nihilo ultimately, obviously from a human standpoint. But if I somehow could imagine theoretically being in this kind of vacuum space, and I kind of create a technology, let's say an AI technology, right? I say in a vacuum space, because if I were to be part of this kind of superstructure, as it were, of AI technicians, technologists, whatever the correct word is, like, I'm already kind of I'm tapping into the work that has gone before, which has a certain kind of historical, like, it's come out of a certain history, right? Western, etc., European, has certain assumptions about how we view the human being built into it, right? But let's say me, in my sort of unique kind of constitution, I would most likely come up with a type of technology that is imbued with my sort of views of the world, how I view other people, good or bad, right? I'm not saying it's necessarily going to be better or worse, right? It's going to have my own proclivities, my own, you see what I'm saying?
Yes. Okay. So there are two ways, I would say, two contexts in which we, just linking back to the previous question, two contexts in which we can address this question. So one is, In the commercial domain where, let's say we have AI and machine learning models where it's relatively straightforward to audit these systems. So going back to the gorilla example. So that was actually first highlighted when Google Photos released this feature where it automatically tagged parts of your image of your photos with, let's say it's a phone, it's a painting, it's a sofa, so on and so forth. And so for people with dark skin, it was tagging that as gorillas. A very similar problem was when a few years ago when Apple released iPhone X. So one of the features that they have was that you could use your phone to as a password, and it's still there, and unlock and lock your phone. So in China, when they released it, as it'll link back to a stereotype that the Westerners have about Chinese people. So let's say you and I, both of us are Chinese, we are not related to one another. We are just friends. And if I use my face to lock my screen as a password, then it turns out that you could also do that to use your face to unlock my phone.
Oh, no way. That's interesting.
And that created an uproar, and Apple apologized. So although these two examples may seem different, from a technical perspective, Apple and Google made the same exact mistake, which is that, so let's go back to how do machine learning models work. Well, right. If you want to build a system which can recognize human faces, then you give examples of lots and lots of human faces to these machine learning models. It just turns out that when
the examples were all white or predominantly white.
Correct.
Right.
In both cases. So, yeah. And the thing is that it's not, at least for facial recognition, it's not just a Western problem, because in the earlier days, I'm talking about, by early days, I mean 2016, 2017.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in the sphere of AI, like 2 years, 4 years, 5 years is a long time, right?
Yes. So similar problems also appeared in China. So when Westerners, when they had to interact with facial recognition systems in China, so they have the same exact problem where all white people look alike, for lack of a better term. And so what these organizations, so another thing that I would want to emphasize is that Apple and Google, we are talking about two organizations which are worth more than $1 trillion. And they made the same mistake. But here's the interesting part. They could easily have avoided this problem if the engineering team who was creating these systems, if they had, let's say, a person who came from a minority population in that group. Again, we had, let's say if there was an engineer who's African-American or Asian American or Indian or Pakistani or Burmese, they would have recognized that in this data set, I don't see people who are, let's say, brown or Chinese. And even if that person had somewhat myopic view of, hey, I don't see people like me. And then the group as a whole would have recognized that yes, he or she is right, and not just him, but we should expand this pool of faces to all sorts of groups globally.
Maybe the racism is not so overt or necessarily conscious. It's more of a subtle racism, like, oh, let's feed the machine with all these examples of human faces. It just happens to be the case that these faces look like me, whether it's in a Chinese context, right, or in the sort of US context in Silicon Valley. I mean, and wasn't it a few months ago? I forget her name, unfortunately, I can't remember her name, but one a lady, an African-American woman who was part of the ethics sort of division in Google, she quit, or no, I think she was fired because she spoke out against the racism of Google, and she was made to lose her job. Is that? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes, it's a very complex issue, I would say. It's like just trying to unpack different layers that. So Yeah, so it's just saying that Google was being racist. I would say that would be very oversimplification.
Okay, no, that's fair. No, please, I want to hear more sort of layered. No, go on, say what you need to say. I
Yes,
appreciate a more layered responses.
yes, but going back to, but that said, there is a somewhat sinister element when it comes to facial recognition. So like examples like, let's say, labeling dark-skinned people as gorillas or not recognizing people of certain ethnic groups. I mean, these are serious problems. The things like this should not happen, but they don't have long-term consequences in terms of affecting, let's say, the quality of life. Again, long-term, I say long-term because in both cases, Google and Apple, they fix these problems. But there are issues where facial recognition systems can have long-term consequences. And that is, the foremost example is in the context of law enforcement. So we have had examples where, at least in the US, where, again, mainly affecting African Americans, the facial recognition systems, they incorrectly identified an African American person who was innocent as a criminal. In some cases, these people had to, again, to emphasize, we're talking about people who are innocent, just going about their daily lives. So somebody is tagged as wrongfully as another person. So that person is now taken to jail, and it takes a couple of days to, at the very minimum, to sort things out. And let's say if that person was supposed to have a job interview or going through something else in life, and now that can have long-term consequences. Another thing is that, again, in the context of the criminal justice domain, and not just facial recognition systems, if you have machine learning systems which are likely to make more mistakes for, let's say, minority or vulnerable populations, then also, given that these populations are less likely to understand or even know that these technologies exist, but they are actually making decisions on behalf of these people, or at the minimum, affecting these people. Unless there's someone else to actually audit these systems, these black box, and we have had examples where these black boxes, and not just even outside of machine learning, these computing systems, they are, let's say, recommending harsher sentences for, let's say, African Americans.
Oh, wow. No way.
And so if that is the case, that these organizations which create these, so these are what are known as criminal risk scoring systems. So basically you have, so the scenario is that, so this is the theory. So when a judge is sentencing someone, he or she takes a multitude of inputs into account, current case, criminal history, so on and so forth. And so multiple districts in the US, so one of the inputs is that, so there's a risk scoring system. It could be machine learning, it could be a non-machine learning system. It gives a score of, it's what is known as a recidivism score. So likelihood that this person will reoffend. And there's a very famous case now. It's literally a textbook case now where, again, I believe this is from 2016 or so, where the researchers, they showed that it was much more biased against African Americans. So if making many more mistakes for African Americans, being lenient against Caucasian populations. And so given similar criminal history, it was predicting that an African American person was more likely to reoffend as compared to a Caucasian person, while in a lot of cases, the opposite was true. So this would be an example of, let's say,
I think I remember reading, this was a few years ago. I took way back when, I took like an AI ethics course at Columbia, and I remember coming across this article that was talking about that actually. And but I don't remember like what if it was even mentioned in the article I was reading, but how would you as a researcher account for that sort of bias? Is it because, again, of the data or that's being that the machine learning systems are going off of? If historically, which we know to be the case in the US context, in the context of the US, that African Americans do receive harsher punishments for the same crimes relative to, people of European descent, then if that's the kind of data it's going off of, does that account for it, or?
Yes, so data is definitely part of the problem. Another issue which has not been, in my opinion, has not been discussed enough is that more often than not, these systems are black boxes. So, which is that there's some inputs, some inputs that you give these systems, and then out magically comes an output. What is going inside this black box, this machine learning model? In most cases, and even non-machine learning models, we don't know. And the reason is that it's a commercial organization, almost always a commercial organization, which created this system. And what they say is that, well, this is the model that we created is based on, let's say, 20 years of research in psychology and sociology in the criminal justice system. This is our bread and butter. We cannot share this. Then we cannot share this because then how else are we going to make money? Okay, I mean, that's a fair point. But here's the thing. If we have, in terms of the core technology which is being used, it's actually not very sophisticated. And if it's a computing system which is making, and again, it's not a matter of national security, so let me just make that clear, but it is something which is making life and death situations, or at the very minimum, quality of life, long-term consequences on life of an individual. These systems should be open source. So it should not be the case that a commercial organization is creating these systems. And let's say if the government hires a contractor, that's fine. But once these systems have been created, they should be open source so that anyone, so let's say the Freedom of Information Act in the US, it should apply here, that anyone, let's say a person like me, who's a machine learning expert, I can assure you that there are literally hundreds and if not thousands of people who would just go and pro bono audit these systems and to determine if they are fair or not. This is something which is lacking. And I strongly believe that machine learning and AI systems which have the ability to, let's say, affect lives of people, affect quality of life, long-term consequences, and not a matter of national security. Let's just open source these things, and in terms of what is going inside. And if that's not possible, at the very minimum, have some ability to check, well, if this is the input, what is the output? Because there are people who are very smart and clever who can just reverse engineer things just by looking at the inputs and outputs.
Sorry, just toggling back and forth. Amazing. Really, really amazing. Wow. Again, so much to chew over and unpack. Where to backtrack a little bit to some of the things you mentioned earlier on about the question of, the metaverse, like stepping into where, slowly but slowly, right, in inverted commas, in sort of very rapidly in sort of in real terms, right, in real historic human terms. But anyway, it may seem so. We're very, we're inevitably stepping into more and more this kind of domain of, sort of immersive technologies and sort of virtual reality and things like this. Can you speak to some of the ethical questions around this? The pros and cons. Let's start with, it's not all doom and gloom, right? This is something I have to repeatedly remind myself, that if it were not for these technologies that I like to rail against every so often, if it were not for these technologies, I wouldn't be able to do a lot of the stuff that I do today, just right now, being able to connect with you live, we're many miles apart. Where you are, it's like 8:30 in the morning, I think, or quarter to 9 in the morning. Where I am, it's 4:45 p.m. So it's remarkable in many ways. And if one is a serious thinker, if one claims to be a serious thinker, then one cannot not consider some of the longer term and short term, so negative aspects. So can you speak to, let's start with some of the positive aspects of this realm that we're entering into, i.e. virtual reality, please?
Yes. So since we're talking about virtual reality and simulation and ethical conundrums, so let me actually start with something which is very personal. So my father, he passed away 8 years ago in 2013. And so when he passed away, so at that time, I didn't have kids. I mean, I was not married. And when even before he had passed away, when I heard just a week before his death, I got a call from my brother, and then he told me that the doctor has said that our father is not going to survive for long. And so one of the things that came to my mind, aside from the grief of losing him, was that I don't have kids, but one day when I have kids, my kids will not have a chance to interact with my father. And growing up, both of my paternal grandparents, they passed away even like approximately 10 years before I was born. So I only have heard stories. I never interacted with them. And my maternal grandparents, they passed away before I was 5. So very, very, very vague memories. And so being a computer scientist, and I guess it's just me. So one of the things that came to my mind was that, well, if my father cannot interact with them, then maybe they can interact with him in the form of a simulation. And after he passed away, I mean, I was grief-stricken for a few years. And then after I had kids, then the idea came back to me. And so I created a simulation of my father that I have been like tinkering with over the course of years, improving it. And so my daughter, she just turned 6 just last month. And she's at this age where now she can interact with the computer. So it's not mostly on terminals. I mean, she's not that old, so she's still learning how to read English. But the way that she interacts with the system is that, so she has a question, and then I type it in on the terminal, and then I get a response, and then I tell her, and then she interacts with this system. And while interacting with this system, so because I'd seen my father interact with my nieces and nephews who are like much, much older. So I do get a sense of, okay, this is something that my father would have said, but then there are other places where that does not sound like him. And so I mean, for me, it raises even at a practical, not just a theoretical level, raises I would say moral and ethical questions.
But this is interesting. Could I ask you very quickly? Well, I mean, thank you so much for sharing that story. That's remarkable. I mean, it's not just a theory. I remember. I mean, I'm sure you know this story, of course. Ray Kurzweil, the famous futurist, and sort of one of his visions is to be able to, slightly different, but kind of relatedly, he has this vision to be able to bring his father back, as it were, from the dead, as he sees it, by use of all his diaries, I think, and something like that. Anyway, the reason why I mentioned his example, I wanted to ask you, how were you able to create this simulation? What sort of data did you use, and how did you program such a thing?
Yeah, so it's a combination of different things. So so like letters, audio conversations that I had transcribed, even video conversation. So basically taking all of this different data and then just transcribing that in the form of a text. There's specifically philosophical problem that I really want to emphasize, and it's very easy to miss. And the reason being is it's very easy to be dazzled by technology, especially in this context. So when I was describing this simulation, I was very careful in describing the interaction. So I stated, just to repeat what I stated, that so I know that my father cannot interact with my kids, but my kids can interact with him. So the implication being that it's a one-sided interaction. So I'm not claiming, and I do not have any,
I see. Yes.
let's say, illusions that there is any sort of consciousness in the system. And I think that's one mistake that Kurzweil and other people also that make. I mean, they're in other domains, I would say, sure, they are quite very smart people, but that I think it's what I like to call thinking. So in artificial intelligence, we have this thought experiment known as, or rather the Turing test, where the idea is that if you have a computer program which can fool you that it's a human, then it possesses intelligence. In my mind, that's a red herring.
Because
let's say if it is something which is not open-ended. I mean, in the Turing test, we don't specify the length of the Turing test. So what if I say, well, the conversation is limited to 5 minutes? Okay, I mean, we had computers, we have software which could do that 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you, by the way, did you ever watch the movie Ex Machina?
Actually, I have not.
Oh my God. Okay. You should really watch Ex Machina. You've heard of Ex Machina, have you? Or,
yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, so you know the premise, this kind of, this fictional company called Blue Book, which is, basically it's kind of Google. You can tell it's Google. This employee is right at the start. He supposedly wins this competition, and he's now going to spend a certain amount of time at the the owner, the founder of Blue Book's home in this far distant, remote place, and he's sort of helicoptered over there. And then while he's there, this kind of very sort of flashy sort of founder of Blue Book, he says, the reason why I really brought you here, do you know why? And guy responds, well, he gives the wrong answer. And the real reason is essentially this owner of the company has managed to create this artificial intelligent entity, and he wants so the test is like taking the Turing test to the next level. So he tells the employee character, I'm forgetting these characters' names. I actually wrote an article about this when the film originally came out. Had a lot of fun writing that article. So he takes the Turing test to the next level in that the employee already knows that this entity is artificially intelligent, and the challenges that he's given is can he still convince himself over a period of time that this entity is indeed artificially intelligent. So what happens, he ends up falling in love with this entity, and like he really starts to believe in its reality, in its consciousness, which is, I thought, was a very interesting thought experiment.
Yes. So going back to Kurzweil and personality emulation, so I would say it's going to be limited by the kind of data that we can collect, and B, if something works 80%, because at the end of the day, I would say the goal of these systems is to, let's say, fool most of the people most of the time, if you're talking about simulations. But here's the thing, most does not mean all, and that applies to people, and that also applies to all the time. So the thing is, if we can, so let's ask this question from a technical perspective, that how is it that we are able to emulate people's personalities? In my case, let's say my father's personality in certain contexts. It's because there are certain interactions which are quite routine. Okay, So you know that every day you're going to have certain types of conversations, yeah, and a lot of human activity throughout the day is very routine in nature. So we are able to capture that. It's where but that said, humans are predictable in a lot of ways, but then there are also many contexts which we are not very predictable. So if you have a loved one that, let's say, even if it's if your spouse that you have lived with for 50 years, they can still surprise you. I mean, I'm not that old, but this is what I've heard and read.
Well, people are full of surprises, aren't they? I mean, this
Correct.
is, and maybe this is the element. Sorry to interrupt again, but there's a recent poll that was done. I came across this article again just yesterday, I think it was, or 2 days ago, maximum 2 days ago, where people, 22% of people who were asked about this, whether they would consider having sex with a sex robot, said yes. And these figures have changed significantly in recent years. And part of the reason I think this article was arguing is that since COVID has hit, people, due to the lack of physical interaction with people, and, this is kind of in a sort of liberal societal context, of course, people have been turning more and more to these kind of artificial means and sex toys and things like that. And so now the very idea of, and the point that I'm trying to make is maybe also that's part of the allure of these artificially intelligent systems, in that it is so predictable. They will not say no, right? From a male point of view, right? Men, sometimes, not sometimes, very often, it's a very serious negotiation that happens all too often, right? That, men, we're kind of stereotypically more eager for sex. Stereotypically, they're sort of more, the sort of
Correct.
Right. Exceptions, of course, and then women very often say no. We have to convince them. So if I have, and this is one of the reasons that porn is so popular, right? Because there is no negotiation going on. It's like, you want it, you get it, right? So I don't know. And I was reading also relatedly, sort of somewhat. Actually, relatedly, something aside, but not that much. That empathy, or rather emotional intelligence, has been significantly dropping in recent years. And I wouldn't be surprised if the study shows that, or studies show that that's as a result of our spending so much time online, right? Interacting with people in these kind of chat sort of systems and things like this. So anyway, sorry to interrupt, but you see my point.
Yes, and I would add that we as a society have not really thought about the long-term consequences of these technologies. So let's say personality emulation. So like one thing that I realize is that it's just, when a loved one dies, then I mean part of being a human is, it's just loss. Right. I mean, it's just part of the bereavement process. There's the likely to be temptation to be, let's say, addicted to a simulation of a loved one who has passed away. So, or let's say, in some sense, even cheapening life. By that, what I mean is that, what if we end up, let's say, 50 years down the road in a society where death loses some of its meaning because when somebody dies, then you can always interact with let's say, their simulation, and not just that, but you can actually edit the simulation.
Oh,
so
yeah.
There's some aspect of that person's personality. So in the US, we have this cultural trope, your racist uncle.
Yeah.
So you like your uncle, but then
just not the racist bits. Yeah.
Yes,
so edit out. That's so interesting. Yeah.
Just edit that out. But the thing is that if that was the only thing that people were going to edit, well, maybe that's not a bad thing. But in reality, people are going to create idealized versions of other people. And I mean, we still do that in our heads. But if you can do that practically, then again, long-term consequences, then, maybe you would not want to interact with the real people, because
Exactly.
it's a real people, a lot of work.
Yeah.
The real world sucks. So let's just spend all of our time in the metaverse.
We can basically become gods in our own little kingdoms, right? Where whatever we say goes. I can dress myself up in any shape or form that I desire, in any, with any physical attributes I desire, any sort of clothes, attire, and things like this. I mean, it poses, to my mind, very serious, potential ethical issues around how we start to view ourselves, right? Let alone how we start to view other people. Again, research has been done already. This is fairly old at this point, whereby it's now shown also that people, as a result of engaging online with these technologies, their empathy has gone down. People struggle to empathize. This is something that's said a lot. I think when hello, little one, I was just going to mention about children, right? That with COVID hitting, does she want to say something? You okay? So that with COVID hitting, a lot of parents have been struggling were struggling certainly with their children having to deal with these sort of, going to school online, right? Not having sort of physical interaction, in-person interaction with fellow students and things like this. And they speaking to parents on this, I mean, this isn't a definitive, this isn't definitive, but anecdotally, I found that a lot of parents struggled with just their children's social skills, and they almost had to relearn some of these social skills when schools reopened. Like, it was like initially kind of tough for them. So, I mean, are we just going to become, the kind of, in the extreme example that, what's that Pixar movie, really cute Pixar movie called WALL-E, I think, WALLE, right? And we see that, this is kind of this dystopian future, and we see the humans in this dystopian future towards, the latter parts of this animated movie, and they're basically these like blobs, right, just sitting in these moving armchairs, and all the food come. I mean, I don't know, are we heading towards some sort of Matrix type scenario where we're just all kind of jacked in, and we just have, I mean, what are some of your thoughts on these issues?
I would say that I would not rule out that as a possibility, because if you really think about it, I mean, there are, again, from a commercial perspective, I mean, there is massive amounts of money to be made, if you really think about it. So, like, everything that you need, it can be virtually created. The only cost that there is, in terms of, let's say, non-human resources, is in terms of energy. That's it. I mean, you don't really have to procure raw materials to, create certain things. So if, let's say, I'm sitting on a chair, so I mean, the chair does not need to be physically created in a factory. You don't need factories. Everything is code in that context. So that allure is definitely there, and in order for us to not go there as a society, I would say very conscious and deliberate steps need to be taken. Is that going to happen? I hope not, that we don't end up there, but I do consider that to be a distinct possibility. But given that, a lot of things in the culture, they are very geared towards a very hedonistic trajectory, I would say that is a distinct possibility. And then coming back.
Now, just to one of the points that you made, that, in order to prevent such a future from coming about, we would have to take, as a collective, right, humanity as such, perhaps, would have to take very considered, conscious steps. But, my retort to that, right, would be, are we historically known for our very conscientious, well-considered steps in anything. I mean, we are very much so, especially in this kind of contemporary era, this kind of consumerist era, we're very much emotionally driven, right? And all these kind of, I mean, it came out a few years ago that Facebook did these social contagion experiments, and that's the stuff we know about, right? that they made public, and God knows what else happens behind the scenes, right? Where they could literally, I mean, they, you know, and you'd know better than me, but they were able to kind of manipulate people's reactions based on certain posts that they made more prevalent in certain people's news feeds over others. So, I mean, my point, I guess, would be that in a world which is so significantly shaped today, currently, by these very, very massive, right, massive in terms of their finances, their financial reach, but also in terms of just their reach, right? I mean, these companies are literally global in terms of their reach. They're literally, they're actually able to and do constantly manipulate us, right? In terms of just our very basic desires, right? Just from a purely consumerist point of view. One doesn't have to get, you know, conspiratorial in one's thinking to realize that. So I wonder, to what extent do we have much of a say in how things unfold?
Yes, so that's where I would say the paradox of choice comes into play. So specifically, so in China, so the government has enacted policies like, let's say, people below a certain age cannot spend more than X number of hours playing video games. They've had camps to detox even adults with respect to playing video games and whatnot. And so, of course, I mean, we're talking about an authoritarian state, but then at the same time, they are, again, not excusing the other things that they're doing. But at least they are also thinking in terms of ensuring that that people do not get addicted to certain things. And if you really think about it, that comes, and the reason that the government is able to do this is, so we can tell one story that it's an authoritarian government, so they are trampling on the rights of the individuals. But the another story is that, and if you talk to Chinese people individually, then we have to remember that we are talking about these policies not in a Western context, but in a predominantly Confucian society. So the government being paternalistic in certain ways, it's not considered a bad thing.
Very interesting.
In a Confucian society, it's even expected in certain in Confucian ethics and Confucian societies. However, if you ask the same exact question in the context, let's say, especially in the US, and not even talking about European countries, then we have very strong opinions regarding what freedom of choice constitutes and whatnot. To that, I'll add that makes a lot of sense in the context of the US, because, you know, we have just the way the country was founded and the concept of rugged individualism and the right of the individual, enlightenment and whatnot. But the thing is, we need to reframe these questions, because Enlightenment and even the industrial era, the reality in which these rights were enshrined and the fundamental questions regarding these fundamental questions were asked, there was, I would even say, orders of magnitude different from the world that we live in right now, because we did not have the kind of abilities that massive corporations that have in terms of data manipulation and whatnot. I mean, Enlightenment philosophers, I mean, Erasmus or Locke and whatnot, I mean, they were very intelligent people, but not in their wildest dreams they could have thought about existence of these technologies. So I think we need to revisit these fundamental questions regarding rights and freedoms and whatnot.
Amazing. Well, this has been amazing, Dr. Ahmad. You are, you know, God bless you, very, very, very smart human being. I'm very blessed in that I get to interview some very, very smart people, thankfully, for Untitled Commons, and you're certainly up there with some of the smartest, and so, I mean, such a rewarding conversation, and I want to be respectful of your time. And I think that that's a very, I think, a cool point to end on, perhaps for now. Just maybe revisiting some of the assumptions that we have had historically in the West about what it means to be a human being, what it means to be, as it were, self-agentive individual in relationship to these technologies, which are incredibly powerful and sort of far-reaching in their sort of just in the very reality, because the very notion of freedom of choice, as you very correctly have pointed out, starts to break down in these contexts. And if we have a freewheeling sort of a system, a capitalistic surveillance capitalist system, which really shapes so much of what we're even conscious of, then I mean, it's quite scary. And maybe a very interesting sort of point that you make vis-a-vis the Chinese context, where it's a Confucian society. Historically, they almost expect a degree of paternalistic sort of control, state control. So maybe here's some food for thought. Maybe that's not necessarily all that bad. And maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? The balance has to be, somewhere in the middle, right? Who knows? But this has been incredible. Any sort of last final words before we wrap up? And I'd love to, because again, this is an area that I'm very, very interested in. Again, it's not my area of expertise by any means. It's something I just happen to have had opportunities to think about a little bit, and sort of from an ethical point of view, from philosophical point of view. And I'd really love to have future conversations with you, and maybe bring one or two other experts in your sort of area to have almost like a bigger discussion about some of these things.
Okay. So I would say there are a couple of, just to end.
Yes.
So again, thank you for having me. It was a great conversations. I loved the questions. There is, I mean, just beyond the societal implications and whatnot, I mean, there are questions like, what are the theological implications of these technologies? So one question that I've been exploring, and I'll be publishing some articles on this next year, hopefully, is coming from an Islamic background, like what are the implications for some of these technologies for Islamic law, for example, for Islamic theology, because if you really think about it, the kind of questions that we encounter in AI and machine learning right now, these are the kind of questions that philosophers, regardless of Western or Islamic or Confucian, they have literally asked for hundreds of years. But one difference is that some of these philosophical questions, they are no longer philosophical questions. They have also become engineering questions.
Wow. Yeah.
And this is unprecedented in human history, I would say. I mean, I do recall reading in an article that we are, if you really think about it, we are living, or we should be rather living in the golden age of philosophy. But that said, there's just not enough interface between people in the humanities and philosophy and people who are actually down in the trenches working on these things. So
yes. Now, this is a huge problem, and people like yourself who, you're clearly very comfortable, of course, thinking about your work from a technical standpoint, but also you're very comfortable thinking in sort of in more theoretical terms, in terms of theology and philosophy. And to my mind, that's key. We have to bridge the gap, this supposed gap, right? I think all too often people, when one specializes in a certain field, it becomes easier and easier to just only focus on the nitty-gritty of that particular thing. But I think the most interesting work, of course, happens when people try to bridge or try to take accounts, make their accounts cognizant of various viewpoints. I think that's the key work.
Right, right. And then just to add to that, I think it's important to internalize, let's say, some of these viewpoints without, let's say, taking these viewpoints as your own. So like thinking about, so just to give an example, so thinking about AI and machine learning, and then academics, because I've been in both sides of the aisle.
Right.
In an academic setting versus in a commercial setting, it's very different. And we should not dismiss, let's say, coming from an academic side, even in an ethical and moral framework, we should not, let's say, dismiss some of the concerns or let's say even the objectives that people have in the commercial domain. Okay, so at the end of the day, they do have to make money.
Yes.
So just to get our point across, it's important to internalize their viewpoint.
Yes.
And then weave a story which addresses, let's say, concerns of both. Because one different thing in AI and machine learning in the last 10 years versus since its conception in the 1950s is that almost all of the cutting edge research in AI and machine learning is being done in industry, not in academia anymore.
Yes.
This is unprecedented. If you look at historically at other domains, this was not the case. The academia was always ahead of the curve. And that's mainly because a combination of different factors, foremost being the availability of massive amounts of money and resources in the industry, and it has massive returns. And then the point regarding internalizing things, I would emphasize that just for the listener, especially people who are younger, is that it's extremely important, I would say, for people in the tech sector to study and learn humanities.
Yes.
And vice versa.
And vice versa, right? Absolutely
important. And the reason is that the kind of questions that you ask, they just cannot arise in one context versus the other. And then just to absolutely end with that. So the one place where I realized this, even outside of tech sector, is that so when I finished my my PhD in computer science, so I actually spent a year at a Christian seminary. So I'm
amazing.
So to add some context, I'm actually a practicing Muslim, so it's not that I converted or even was planning.
No, sure.
But I wanted to get an insider's perspective of another, let's say, theological tradition.
Beautiful. Yes.
But without having that as my opinion. So I think that particular line of reasoning, that kind of thinking, I think that's also required for when we try to mesh humanities and technology.
That's beautiful, and that's a very beautiful insight, and something that's much needed and much more widely needed. I think all too often, in my experience, the sort of Talal Asadian sort of conceit, which I think is a very correct conceit, that in order to, which is widely accepted now, that in order to understand Islam, one should, learn, speak to Muslims and see how they understand their tradition, right? And in all its kind of variegated manifestations and things like that. Now, Muslims, we recognize this right off the bat, but we don't very often, obviously present company not included, very often we make the mistake of, I think the gross mistake of not being charitable enough when it comes to people of other faith traditions. We don't seek to understand their faith traditions, how they understand their faith traditions. Very often, one can become polemical and things like that. And polemics has its place, obviously, in a kind of it has a certain social function, but and it can be productive of certain, intellectual insights. But I think in order to really make, headway, I think in a variegated, constructive fashion, we really have to start to understand how the apparent other, the so-called other, understands things, and that's very profound. Really appreciate it. Well, once again, thank you so much, Dr. Ahmad, for your incredible, very generous time and your wonderful sort of insights today. And I look forward to very much look forward to future conversations, because this stuff is not going away, right? This stuff is only increasing. I mean, if anything, we should be spending more and more time thinking about this stuff in a very intelligent fashion and having some, important conversations. I mean, philosophy purely understood, theology purely understood is all great, it's all well and good, metaphysics, etc., etc. I love that stuff. But all too often I feel, again, the specialists in those domains, they're just so hyper focused on those questions, and yet the world is unfolding in a very different manner from some of these very theoretical questions, right? But to your point, these theories, a lot of these abstract ideas are no longer abstract ideas. Very often they're practically manifesting themselves. So I'd love to unpack, sort of pick your brain a little more in the future, God willing, about some of these questions, because these are very, very important questions to my mind. I mean, to use this kind of overly used word these days, it seems, these are kind of existential questions. It's not just some theoretical thing anymore.
Yeah, definitely. I would say, just to restate what I said earlier, that we live in a time where ethical and moral questions are engineering questions and or other problems. And if you take a longer view of history, I would say not only these things are going to increase, but we actually live in the beginning of the era of artificial intelligence. So 2021 these days, so they may actually be, let's say, the beginning of history when it comes to these things.
That's so interesting. Yeah, people may look back, a few years down the line and say, "Oh, remember those good old days when people were just kind of theorizing about this stuff?" 2021. I mean, it feels like there's a watershed moment happening. It really feels like that. With the announcement of metaverse, and COVID was a significant watershed as well. So some fascinating things happening. Well, again, thank you so much, Dr. Ahmad. God bless you for all that you do and all your sort of very sort of serious thinking in some very important realms. And I very much look forward to future discussions with you.
Excellent.
Okay, God bless. Bye for now.